and welcome to your lecture on the Roman Empire Part 2, Christianity. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Throughout this course, we've talked about the lives of many great men. You know they're great because it's right there in their title. Sargon the Great, Ramses the Great, Cyrus the Great, Augustus Caesar. These men left behind them statues, paintings, and inscriptions lauding their marvelous accomplishments to the sky, making sure that history would remember them. And so it's interesting that the man whom history remembers best of all had no statues or paintings made of him during his lifetime. In fact, we really don't know what Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like. And yet this man, Jesus, who lived from about 4 BC to about 30 AD, would prove to be possibly the most influential person in all of human history. Jesus was a Jewish preacher from the line of David who performed miracles. He began his ministry at 30 years of age, and his teachings proved so controversial that the Jewish leaders ended up handing him over to the Romans, who crucified him as a rebel, crucifixion being the normal punishment for rebels in those days. In killing Jesus' enemies figured they had squashed his following as well. Little did they know that only 3 days after Jesus' death, his followers would claim to have seen him risen from the dead and would go on to found what would become the world's largest religion, Christianity. What you believe about the validity of Jesus' teachings and his claims to be the Messiah depends on your religion, but most historians, whatever their religion or lack thereof, agree that Jesus was a historical figure, that is, that he was an actual person. Christians go a step further. We believe that Jesus was God himself come to earth in human flesh to save humanity, and it's a major part of our faith to spread the good news of his resurrection. Early Christian communities were very diverse in terms of background and culture and socioeconomic status. That is, how rich and powerful you are, or aren't. However, the fact that Christianity did away with the notion that wealth was a sign of divine favor and focused instead on equality and forgiveness and salvation for all believers, as well as Jesus' active compassion toward traditionally powerless and despised members of society, think the poor, women, tax collectors, meant that many of the members of the early church were from poor, marginalized, or oppressed groups. In the early years of the church, people held everything in common and met to worship and break bread in people's homes. And in fact, if you go to parts of the world where Christianity is less common today, you'll still find home churches. When I lived in Japan, for example, where only about 1% of the population is Christian, I attended services in a room that was really just an extension of the pastor's house. One of the most defining characteristics of Christianity was its focus on ministry. Christians took care of widows, abandoned babies, the poor, and the sick. And this really set them apart from the surrounding culture, because while charity was essential in Jewish culture, from the earliest days, God had exhorted the Jews to take care of the poorest and neediest members of their society. Charity was definitely not part of the surrounding Greek or Roman culture. Greeks and Romans didn't see any virtue in giving something to somebody who could give you anything in return. Sure, it might be a shame that the poor were poor, but it was really none of your business. Your priority was to take care of yourself and of your family. So the fact that Christians were out there rescuing babies from gutters and feeding poor people really set them apart from the surrounding culture. A stark example of this cultural difference occurred when the Black Plague hit the city of Alexandria in the 3rd century AD. Most of the population fled in terror, abandoning the sick and the dying behind them, doing everything they could to avoid becoming infected. But the Christians behaved differently. According to a letter written by the leader of the Christian community at the time, quote, "Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Often at the expense of their own lives, Christians did not avoid plague victims, but instead sought them out, nursing them back to health, or at least giving them comfort in their dying hours." It is important when studying history to be wary of propaganda, and so it's important to look at accounts of Christian charity written not just by Christians, but by their enemies as well. When the Emperor Julian was attempting to squash Christianity and instead inspire belief in the traditional Roman gods, he wrote this: It is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, that is the Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. Julian then goes on to say that it is essential that the polytheistic priests start supporting public charity the way that the Christians and the Jews do. The Christian community grew and grew and grew. In the year AD 40, about 10 years after Jesus' death, it's estimated that there are only about 1,000 Christians in the empire. But by the year AD 300, fully 10% of the empire was Christian, about 6 million people. One of the reasons for the spread of Christianity was that Christ's teachings and Christians' charity attracted new people to the church. People heard the good news, they saw the good works, they wanted to join. The second reason was that they were allowed to join. Although Christianity had its roots in Judaism, it allowed Gentiles, that is, non-Jews, to join. And this Christianity was pretty unusual. Most religions of the day were something that you were born into, either because you were born in a certain area or because you had a certain heritage background. That Christianity allowed anyone to join the faith. And the final reason for the spread of Christianity is the wide network of relatively safe roads throughout the Roman Empire. In other words, travel was possible. People could go from place to place, spreading the good news and founding churches. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however. From the very beginning, 30 AD, all the way up to 312 AD, there were misconceptions about Christianity that led to hostility and outright persecution. One major issue that cropped up early on was that of religious exclusivity. If you remember, Roman society was very religiously inclusive. Any and all religions in the Roman Empire could easily be folded into the Roman religion. More gods, the merrier. But Christianity was not inclusive. Christianity was exclusive. Christians worshipped one God, theirs. Did not worship the Roman gods, did not worship the Roman emperor, and this simultaneously baffled and offended the Romans. Baffled because they couldn't understand why you wouldn't just worship all these other gods alongside your own, and offended because if you did not worship the Roman gods and Roman emperor, not only were you rejecting Roman society and culture, but you also were refusing to participate in a major aspect of daily and social life, that is the Roman festival. Roman festivals, which pretty much always had a religious element, were a huge part of daily life. They often happened at least once a week, and they involved not just processions, but also all of your major sporting events, your gladiatorial games, your chariot races. Everyone participated in these festivals and holidays, except the Christians and the Jews. And even in today's society, which is much less focused on holidays, you can see how it might be off-putting if every time you asked your family member to go to the theater with you or celebrate Christmas together or shoot off fireworks on the 4th of July, that friend said, sorry, against my religion. The Romans found it more than just off-putting. They found the Christians' refusal to participate in festivals and holidays to be antisocial, intolerant, and downright treasonous, because to not worship the emperor wasn't just unpatriotic, it was the act of a traitor. From a Roman perspective, not only were Christians antisocial and intolerant, but they also had some very questionable religious practices. Your average Roman was not well versed in Christian theology, and so when he heard things like Christians claiming to eat the body and drink the blood of their savior, alarm bells began to go off. Confusion about practices like communion among the Christians led to accusations of cannibalism. As you can see, despite their many acts of charity in the community, the Romans were not necessarily predisposed to like the Christians, and this hostility sometimes led to outright persecution. After all, as a small, powerless, and often despised minority, Christians made excellent scapegoats. Scapegoats are people that you blame when things go wrong. During periods of persecution, Christians lost their jobs, their legal rights, and if they refused to give up their faith, their lives. To avoid persecution, Christians hid and held worship services in catacombs. Those are underground tunnels of tombs, and talked about their faith in code, such as by the famous fish, which was used to mark meeting places and identify believers. If, when meeting a stranger, you drew this fish in the sand, and the stranger drew one back, you knew you were in good company. Far from convincing people to abandon their faith, the brave deaths of the martyrs, those are people who die for their faith, convinced others to stay strong as well. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, wrote the Roman Christian author Tertullian. After almost 300 years of disdain, hostility, and outright persecution, Roman attitudes took an about-face in 312 AD, when the conversion of a man named Constantine led to Christianity becoming the favored religion of the empire. In the year 312 AD, before a major battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, a general named Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light, and below it the words in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. He took it to heart, won the battle, became emperor, and began promoting Christianity. In the year 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted freedom of religion to all people and restored legal rights and confiscated property, that is, property the government had stolen, to the Christians. In 325 AD, he helped organize the Council of Nicaea, whose Nicene Creed defined Christian beliefs and is still used in many church services today. Christianity was now here to stay. Despite brief periods of pagan renewal, it became the primary religion of the Roman Empire. It survived the fall of that empire and is today the largest religion in the world. Christianity might have survived the fall of the Roman Empire, but not everything did. Next week, we'll look at a lot that was lost and had to be later rediscovered when we discuss the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. See you next week.